1968, former President Lyndon Johnson dropped out of the presidential election because he thought he wasn't gonna win. He wasn't popular enough. Doesn't that remind you of someone? Now, DNC chair Hal Boggs did the same thing that our current DNC chair, Jamie Harrison, did. No one learns, apparently. And he had the political elite. And yes, by that I mean the Democratic National Committee choose the replacement for Lyndon Johnson. Guess who they chose? The Vice President, Hubert Humphrey. The only problem is that while they positioned that Hubert Humphrey was deserving of the bid in order to become the president because he's next in line, it just makes sense, political strategy, decorum. He was actually much more unpopular than Lyndon Johnson because he supported the Vietnam War. Now, contrary to Harris's VP support of Biden's Gaza policy, the difference is that Americans don't vote on foreign policy alone. The only reason we vote on foreign policy is when that directly impacts us. In the realm of Vietnam War, Americans were being unalived. In Gaza, and particularly in Palestine, yes, there have been Americans who have been unalived, but normally, the average American does not feel the impact that Palestinians are feeling when it comes to the conflict. So therefore, there are not enough radicals who vote on Palestine alone. However, while Gaza itself wasn't the reason why she lost, the reason why she lost is the same reason that Hubert Humphrey lost. Not even Hubert Humphrey, the same reason that Democrats and Americans lost in 1968, the Democratic National Committee. Why? Do you know who Hubert Humphrey lost to? Richard Nixon. It seems to me that the political strategy that the Democratic National Committee loves to inherit to generation just fails, but they refuse to actually change it. The fact is that the problem isn't the team or the ideology necessarily, but it is the coach, right? The DNC refuses to change its strategy, and as such, we continue losing. See, the win of Richard Nixon was a consequential turning point in American history. And while I wouldn't blame Gaza for Harris losing, assuming there is no fancy stuff that is substantial enough to change the outcome, I would blame it on two things. One is her association with the Democratic Party under the Democratic National Committee, who has failed to restore any trust in the party after the 2016 scandal of Wilding versus DNC Services Corporation. This was about how the then DNC chair, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, I'm pretty sure I said that wrong, I'm sorry, sabotaged the Bernie Sanders campaign. And the justification was that although the Democratic mandate is that they don't have a favorite, there is no legal consequences to violating a mandate. Do you see how sketch that is and how that erodes trust in the party? Because they see it as fit to remove themselves, to break the mandate that they have promised to the members just because, and without consequences. And you're going to say, well, Bernie wasn't going to win anyways. Well, let him lose, Actually sabotaging it made them look bad. And I voted for Hillary Clinton. Not necessarily because I was all in it, but because I dragged my feet for the party. And I just didn't feel like America was ready for what Bernie had to offer, even though I loved it. But this left a dark stain in the trust between the party and the people, and rather than restoring it, they just swept it under the rug. Do you think that Facebook, Meta, and changing their names to Meta restored the trust that they lost from the Cambridge Analytica scandal? No. Even more now in this reality, but even before that, they hadn't restored that trust. Why do you think that just pretending like it never happened will make Democrats and progressives trust in the party again? Now, actually, I would say the thing that lost Harris the election was her association with this party, with this coach. And Jamie Harrison didn't help in continuing this inheritance of sabotaging and hoping that in progressives being really limited in options with the lesser two evils, that would be forced to forgive anything that they did because we would feel a duty to go and vote against the most evil, right? The Jamie Harrison's DNC, what did they do? They canceled the primary in Florida. How is that democratic? They also used litigation in order to remove Jill Stein from the ballot. If Jill Stein wasn't going to win, then why remove her from the ballot? Again, there's not enough radicals to remove substantial support from Harris. Rather, what they gave Harris was a much more center to right campaign. However, now we're stuck in a reality that I was warning as they were running, which is that even if we get people from the right voting for Harris in the executive and the presidential election, they're going to vote red in the local elections. So now we're removing incentive from progressives to actually go out and vote local because now they see it as Democrats are abandoning them and moving to the right. And there's a false blame to the voters because people are like, well, that's what people voted for. That's what happens for people not going out to vote. Yet, it's not the people who should be forced to sacrifice themselves for parties who are not appealing to them, but it is up to these parties to appeal to the people. And sure, I drag my feet for the party, at least unless had Joe Biden continued running, I don't think I would have voted Democrats, and I'll tell you why. And him allowing for colleges and just in general for law enforcement to beat up on college students just because they were criticizing his best friend in the country that he said in 1967 that had it not existed, the United States would be forced to invent it. That tells me that he wanted to violate constitutional protections or restrict them for a entity that isn't even a beneficiary to the constitutional protections. That is Israel, that is Israelis. And that's what the TikTok ban was, right? Helping the narrative so that they can win on that end. In that reality, I didn't see any difference between a dictator who is a fascist and is only after his own interest and a leader who isn't afraid to subvert his own constituents' protections in order to maximize his foreign strategy. This centers the people here in the United States and recenters people outside of the United States. So when he dropped out, although I had criticisms of Harris, ultimately I came to a conclusion. She is as fault for Biden's gossip policy as the employees of questionable companies like Meta. And currently, it's kind of like liberals working at Meta, working at Tesla, working at these companies where their leaders are questionable. However, they're just the employees, right? And that's what Vice President Harris was at that time. She can give advice, however, it is up to Biden on whether or not he's going to decide one way or the other. And the second thing I think is just patriarchy, it's misogyny, because when you look at how Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, is excelling, it's because she has a different approach and putting forth her femininity as a president, right? She kind of strokes Trump's ego and it works. However, Harris has a different way that's much more bold, which I respect, which I love. However, American men have an issue with feeling smaller under a larger and much more powerful feminine leadership. However, I do think that the latter, so the patriarchy, one could have been circumvented had there been better strategy, had there actually been a restoration in trust in the Democratic Party via a change in the Democratic National Committee. However, it remains itself as a private entity, and that's what we saw when it came to the election of the DNC chair. It was the political elite again, and again, they're just going to inherit the same strategy that lost us the election time and time again. Particularly, it's not going to restore the trust that was lost under Debbie in 2016. So assuming no fancy stuff, Harris didn't lose the election because of herself, but because the DNC gave her such shitty strategy, terrible campaign, and the consultants just kept a traditional sense of strategy that historically has failed us, and as a result, we got the same result as 1968. In 1968, we were consequentially left with Nixon, and this one, we're left with a tyranny. Thank you, Democratic National Committee. Again, it is not the ideology, it is the coach, and we need to get rid of it. Because there's Trojan horses in the Democratic Party. I don't care if you think it's our only option. The fact that we have to vote in Trojan horses says a lot. Let's say bye to familiar misery. Let's demand more.